Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few questions to the proponent of the bill, through you, if I may.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the proponent know what percentage of housing authority residents are currently registered to vote?
Why don't we rephrase that to just be a straight-out question of fact, as opposed to what Representative McGee does or doesn't know?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So through you,
Yes.
how many housing authority residents are registered to vote? Through you.
That's much better. Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, I do not have that statistic on hand, but what I do know is that we, in the state of Connecticut and even in this country, we encourage people to be a part of the political process, and that is through using their voice by voting. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman for his answer, and I could not agree more. I think it's very important that we fully support and profess the idea and concept of voting. In fact, the town of Monroe, which is one of the towns I serve today, had their annual budget referendum, and due to the anticipated schedule of today, I made sure that I voted ahead of time to make sure that my vote was cast. And I, always try to reach out to everyone through social media, through personal text, to encourage them to vote whenever there is an election. So I wholeheartedly agree. But the reason I asked the question was simply just to get at the fact that if we knew what the percentages were, so if there's a population of housing authority residents and let's say 99% were registered. Now that's probably not the case, but not having that data, I think having that data would be helpful in the decision of supporting or not supporting this bill. Another question through you, Mr. Speaker, if I may.
Proceed.
The voter application would be provided to the resident, is my understanding of this. Would the application to register to vote be contingent upon the application of housing? Through you.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, that's a great question. The goal is to provide applications to individuals who have received a bona fide, if you would, maybe that's too strong of a word, an offer from that particular housing unit, so that you don't have people just walking into any particular housing authority or housing development, if you would, asking for applications. So through you, Mr. Speaker, it would be to prospective tenants that have seriously considered moving into a particular unit.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the chairman for his answer. But just so that I'm clear, as a hypothetical, if I were to be applying to a housing authority, I would need to be accepted before I was given a voter registration application. Is that correct, through you?
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, correct. And in addition to that, those individuals who accepted the offer to live in a particular housing unit and have been there for a few years and they go through a recertification, they too would be offered a voter application as well to update their address or any information. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And that the reason I was asking was I wanted to be clear whether or not the voter registration was actually part of the application. If I'm hearing correctly, once the application is processed and approved and the person is accepted into the housing authority, only then would they be offered the voter registration as part of the acceptance. Is that correct? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, correct.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few more questions to the chairman, through you. As of right now, I know the town of Monroe does have at least one housing authority, and I guess my question is, are all housing authorities operated the same way, and are there housing authorities that are operated by different levels of government? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, the fine gentleman did a great job explaining the different types of housing options or authorities. There are some that are managed by municipalities. There are also some managed by the state of Connecticut through the Department of Housing. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So to follow up on the answer to that question, there would be municipal employees as well as state employees administrating some of these programs. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Just to clarify, I'm not certain, through you, Mr. Speaker, that employees of these housing authorities are necessarily state employees. Many of the housing authorities receive funding through portfolios that are managed by the Department of Housing. So many of these employees are municipal employees or just nonprofit employees running housing authorities. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And do we know in those nonprofits who's in charge of the hiring and firing of the staff? Is it the director or CEO of the organization, or is it somehow the Department of Housing? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. CEO, President, Executive Director, and its board. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And how many housing authorities are there in the state of Connecticut? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
That's a great question. So I'm going to charge it to being a new chair of housing, and that's something that I'll do my homework on. I'm not sure. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm not trying to put the good chairman on the spot. I just was going through some of the public testimony, and I noticed that there was one housing authority that testified in favor of this bill. However, I would assume that there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of housing authorities throughout the state of Connecticut, therefore showing that one out of that many that supported it, while certainly there was no housing authorities that opposed it with public testimony, I just didn't see a strong showing of support from the housing authority agencies, and those are ultimately the ones that are going to be administrating this. So that was one of the concerns I had. Another question through you, Mr. Speaker. In lines 3 through 4, it includes the language concerning the Department of Social Services, Labor Department, and the Department of Motor Vehicles in the way that they distribute voter registration information. I know that many of us in the chamber are familiar with the motor voter law that was passed recently. If the good chairman could relay any thoughts on the success of those programs, and if we think that this would be, again, a benefit to those in housing authorities. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker. It's definitely a great question, and just taking a look at the bill, lines 3 through 5, where it explains the Department of Social Services, Labor, and DMV, and it adds housing authorities as defined in Section 8-39. I think there are some best practices that housing authorities could adopt, but I think the fine gentleman would agree with me that there are some, I think, processes and systems that we ought to improve. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I agree. I've heard stories, not all bad, about the motor voter program when people have either renewed their license or registered a motor vehicle. One in particular that really stuck with me was a good friend of mine who I work with went to go vote in the primaries this past, in 2018, the gubernatorial primary. And when he arrived to vote, and as we know in the state of Connecticut, you need to be registered with a party. And he always believed he was registered as a Republican, and that's how he registered when he was at first 18 years old. Showed up to the polls, and come to find out, he was registered unaffiliated. He does not have any idea why that would have happened, and the only thing that we could surmise was that it was possible that when he registered his vehicle, that there was a change in the voter registration in party. And as we know, on the day of the primary, it's too late to change your party from unaffiliated or from one party to the next. So in theory, he was disenfranchised from the system, which obviously is not a good thing. I'm sure it's something that has happened to others if it's happened to this gentleman. But it's a story that stuck with me, and it's part of those processes that you talked about. And I would hope that if this bill were to move forward and be successful, that there would be some standards, some scope of practice put in by either the Secretary of State or the Department of Housing to make sure that these type of errors don't occur, that the validity and the accuracy of voter records are kept as sacred as possible. Mr. Speaker, I have two more questions through you. The first one would be, The fiscal note attached to this says that there's no cost to municipalities and no cost to the state of Connecticut, saying that their Secretary of State is certainly capable of providing this information. Was there any discussion during public hearing or during other conversations at the committee that had to do with any costs to towns, cities, or the housing authorities?
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in line 68, it states, a housing authority shall assist an individual in completing the application form if such assistance is requested. Through you, Mr. Speaker, the intent of this language is what exactly and what kind of assistance would be provided? Through you.
Representative McGee.
Great question. It could be in many of our housing authorities, and I'll just use Hartford Housing Authority as an example. We have a huge population of Spanish speaking only tenants, and it could just be help completing a particular application or being provided with direction on, where to sign or where to drop off this particular voter application. And it could be as simple as that. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I know that we have certain rules and regulations about who can assist in absentee ballots, who can assist in absentee ballot applications. Having gone through that in the past election with a neighbor of mine who is confined to his house and not able to leave. Just a question through you, Mr. Speaker. Will there be some procedures put in place to guarantee that there wouldn't be any sort of policy discrepancy or issue in having assistance provided to someone registering to vote? Through you.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, there are current policies and standards in place for supervised absentee ballots, registrar of voters. They already have sort of guidelines on how, as you've mentioned, how many of these applications should be completed. I would imagine that the Secretary of State would provide those same instructions on how to handle voter registration cards, absentee ballots, supervised voting, et cetera. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What would happen, what would be the penalty if a housing authority did not give that voter registration card to a applicant who has received housing? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, we don't necessarily have any penalties in this bill. It was more or less, providing, again, that prospective tenant with a voter registration application with hopes that on the honor system that many of these housing authorities would do just that. So to the fine gentleman, we don't necessarily have any fines or penalties, but I would imagine that that particular tenant or prospective tenant, having heard of successful passage of this bill, would then file a complaint with, its registrar of voters. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so just to clarify, would there be any disciplinary action that could be taken on the employee as a result of this law? Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
That does not cover, we don't cover that in this particular bill, Mr. Speaker. Through you.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And so just to clarify, there's no provision in here that would prevent a housing authority from disciplining an employee that failed to provide that registration form. Through you, Mr. Speaker.
Representative McGee.
Through you, Mr. Speaker, no.
Representative Sredzinski.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have no further questions.